Good morning. We gather today amidst the swirl of snow and the hope of a new year. Hope for a world transformed, a heart healed, a clear path shown. We gather in the hope that with each new day and each drawn breath, we will be worthy of the lives we have been given. Welcome.
On New Year's Day, Boston Globe columnist Ellen Goodman wrote her last column before retiring, and she quoted her own words from 30 years before. As a younger woman, she had written, "There's a trick to the graceful exit. It begins with the vision to recognize when a job, a life stage, a relationship is over, and to let it go. It means leaving what's over without denying its validity or its past importance in our lives. It involves a sense of the future, a belief that every exit line is an entry, that we are moving on rather than out. It's hard to recognize that life isn't a holding action, but a process. It's hard to learn that we don't leave the best parts of ourselves behind back in the dugout or the office. We own what we learned back there. The experience and the growth are grafted onto our lives. And when we exit, we can take ourselves along, quite gracefully." I love that last line. We can take ourselves along, quite gracefully. This month, we're exploring the questions of our covenant in listening circles, as you heard Charlie describe earlier, and this is taking another step in charting a course for our collective future. This congregation's past has been deeply part of the Christian tradition, and our current covenant, which you heard Charlie read earlier, in devotion to truth and in the spirit of Jesus Christ, we unite for the worship of God and the service of all, has been a touchstone of our theological roots and our spiritual aspirations. We've established, though, pretty clearly that the language of this covenant doesn't speak to all of us in a modern Unitarian Universalist congregation. And so we're examining how to take ourselves along gracefully into the next expression of who we are as a community. This month in worship, we'll be exploring the different expressions of spiritual and theological questions that are at the core of who we are and who we want to be as a community. This week, we're exploring notions of God and atheism. So we light our chalice each week to remind ourselves that with our different ways of seeing, we do come together in a community of fellowship in which all are welcome, and we all seek the same light.
Today's reading is from Chris Hedges. I don't believe in atheists. The question, he writes, is not whether God exists. It is whether we contemplate or are utterly indifferent to the transcendent. That which cannot be measured or quantified, that which lies beyond the reach of rational deduction. We all encounter this aspect of existence in love, in beauty, alienation, loneliness, suffering, good, evil, and the reality of death. These powerful, non-rational, super-real forces in human life are the domain of religion. All cultures have struggled to give words to these mysteries and moments of transcendence. God, and different cultures have given God many names and many attributes, is that which works upon us and through us to find meaning and relevance in a morally neutral universe. You see, religion is our finite, flawed, and imperfect expression of the infinite. The experience of transcendence This struggle to acknowledge the infinite need not be attributed to an external being called God. As others have pointed out, the belief in a personal God can, in fact, be anti-religious. But the religious impulse addresses something just as concrete as the pursuit of scientific or historical knowledge. It addresses the human need for the sacred. God is, as Thomas Aquinas argues, the power that allows us to be ourselves. God is a search, a way to frame the questions. God is a call to reverence.
I knew I wasn't going to be able to follow that act, so. The question always seems to come in a slightly different form, but it plagues me nonetheless. Are you a believer? I remember distinctly being asked once when I was in college, working at Nunzio's Pizza, assembling slices for the hungry students who came in unstoppable waves throughout the day. I didn't know my fellow employees well at all, and there wasn't a lot of time for chit-chatting, so we had a few moments of brief conversation in which to know and be known by each other. Fresh, hot cheese pizzas were stacked on a shelf just above us, and me and a coworker had the job to take the slices off of those shelves, assemble the toppings on them, send them through a warming oven, and then back to the hungry mouths on the other side of the restaurant. There was a lull in the line on this particular evening, and I got a chance to actually look my coworker in the face for a moment. We grabbed slices and slapped toppings on them, and she told me that she was from Colorado Springs and was studying at the University of New Mexico, as was I. I shared some similar information with her, including the fact that I was involved in something at church. And she looked at me importantly, sized me up, as if her next words would be the key that would determine who I would be to her. Are you a believer? I suppose my pause was the best answer I could have given her. Folks who think of themselves regularly as believers don't seem to have to hem and haw about an answer. I had a feeling that I knew what she meant, but I looked at her quizzically and said, "In what?" A need from a customer interrupted us, and after a few more seconds of thought, I realized that I did, in fact, know what she meant. She might have thought my reply was sarcastic, in fact, but really, it mattered to me exactly what she was asking about. No matter what she meant more specifically, I probably didn't have a yes or no answer for her. So the song you just heard was regularly on my tape deck at the time of that conversation. I was very decidedly a non-believer in the God that it rails against. I had witnessed the ways that bad things happen to good people plenty of times. I had seen the workings of poverty and the shattering effects of violence. They were all the evidence I needed to seriously question the existence of a God who knows all, sees all, and can control all. A God who's a sort of larger-than-life version of a person with passions and prejudices and a hand in everything that happens. No one who has suffered or witnessed suffering in our world can easily reconcile that big notion of God with the fact of suffering. Scholars and priests have worked hard for centuries to tie up neat ways that those things can coexist, and those theologies are compelling and nurturing to a great many good and reasonable people in the world. But if you pay attention to the news these days, you would think that the only option, if you aren't someone who can believe in that God who allows so many terrible things to happen and still will magically save only those who believe in a particular way, the only option, if you don't believe that, is to vehemently hate all those who do. A slew of books have been published in the last couple of years with titles like God is Not Great, The God Delusion, and The End of Faith. Each of them seems to have varying degrees of the same argument. First, that the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is impossible as described in any of those holy scriptures. Second, rational people cannot believe the stories of scriptures to be true, especially because they can't be reconciled with the findings of science or historical inquiry. Third, religion has been the basis on which terrible things have been done in the world, from genocide to sexual abuse to terrorism, and therefore, fourth point, most important, religion should be eradicated if at all possible. Now, I'm aware that Unitarian Universalists are likely a good number of the fans of these books, because we pride ourselves on reason and put a lot of faith in science as a rule. We like to think that we've done away with all of the magical thinking of more traditional religions. And we certainly don't subscribe to biblical literalism. But I think we need to be careful about an easy allegiance to this brand of atheism as well. Along their merry way, this group of atheists manages to completely malign as ignorant and foolish anyone who participates in religion. That would be all of us. Their contempt almost drips off the pages, and the authors sometimes seem to have very personal vendettas that they're working out as they write their theories. While they claim that they're making the case for reason, they certainly don't come off as dispassionate, rational, or even sometimes ethical. Our own religious tradition has tried to bridge the seeming divide between religion and science, between belief and non-belief, for at least the last 2 centuries. The Enlightenment made it possible for us to establish our faith in human reason and moral improvement, and that conviction found its way into Unitarianism that separated us from our Calvinist roots in the early 19th century. The freedom to build a theology grew Universalist thought in the same century, opening up the possibility of salvation to all of God's creation. Unitarian trust and faith in human reason pushed the boundaries and gave birth to the Transcendentalist movement, which extended us even further into a realm that said we could understand God not just through sacred scripture and in church, but wherever we might encounter God's creation, at Walden Pond, in a lover's gaze, in a soft snowfall. All the while, we maintained a religious sensibility. We've acknowledged that there is more to all of it than we can know, that we need one another to help discern truth, to help work for justice, to grow in compassion. Both Unitarians and Universalists humbled themselves in the last century, 2 centuries ago now, I guess, as the entity beyond our human knowing that could call us to some better life in the world. But by the early 20th century, there was a fervent movement afoot to express that search for meaning in terms that didn't refer to God at all. Human possibility and human reason were enough, said a group of 34 men, many of them Unitarian ministers, who signed the Humanist Manifesto in 1933. It was their conviction that humanism could be a religious and ethical path, that the best in humanity could be cultivated in moral and spiritual ways without referring to any supernatural beings or powers or stories. Religion must formulate its hopes and plans in light of the scientific spirit and method, they wrote in that manifesto. They were seeking a way to be religious, to appreciate the human truths to be found in religious stories without having to be believers in that old sense. Many of those who signed this manifesto also called themselves atheist, meaning they didn't subscribe to the God that the traditional religion told them they must believe in. But they did believe in the right and importance of the moral center that religion could provide. And they were certainly respectful of the intellect and integrity of folks who followed traditional religions. Those wise men who gathered in the wake of the Great Depression to cobble together a hopeful possibility for humankind made it okay to be religious without God. The humanist sensibility of that manifesto has been the common ground that has united our faith tradition through this last century. Through the merger of Unitarians and Universalists, through the explorations of Eastern religions and spiritual practices, through the expansion of earth-centered spiritual traditions, the fundamental tenets of religious humanism have been our common ground. The new atheists, though, are seeking anything but common ground. In response to the current rise in religious fundamentalism, they've created their own kind of fundamentalism that in its own way is just as frightening. Journalist Chris Hedges, in his book, I Don't Believe in Atheists, this morning's reading is from, points out that the new atheism has made an idol of human reason and science, ignoring the ills that are brought on by science if it's not offered some moral corrective. They replace the magical thinking of a God who will save us if only we say the right prayers and do the right rituals with the magical thinking of humanity saving itself through the use of science. Even in the secular world of the marketplace and scientific development, there is plenty of evidence that we humans are not always inclined to reproduce the best in ourselves. Greed and the lust for power win out regularly over generosity and solidarity. And it happens with or without religious foundation. Darwin's theory of evolution, which was not supported by any religious establishment, was immediately put to use to justify slavery and genocide. The supposedly self-correcting financial markets that are built on economic calculations can also be brought to their knees by human abuses, as we've seen all too clearly. All of our scientific development over the last 2 centuries has crippled the planet, and now the race for a solution is being caught up in human power struggles. Science faces the same obstacles that religion does in the end, our human limitation. We are limited in our goodness, and we are also limited in what we can prove and know. There is an important role for a grounded disbelief in God. Whether it's an expression of despair at the suffering in the world or an expression of faith in some less nameable quality, atheism is a path that can and does have integrity. Atheists have helped us to be freed from, and scientists have helped us certainly to be freed from that notion that the earth was created, all of creation was completed in 6 days. That same sense of integrity, that same sense of exploration and reconciling what we are told with what we experience and see can be the foundation of a profound spiritual life. When we acknowledge our despair at the suffering in the world, we open our minds and hearts to the ways that we can be one. That meaning that we seek in our times of despair, in our awareness of suffering, is the deepest path to wisdom. In religious community at its best, we take ourselves off of that big struggle in our world, the struggle between yes and no, the struggle between God and no God, the struggle between today and tomorrow. And we invite ourselves to take a pause, to know one another, to experience the fullness of who we are, the fullness of who we can be, and keep one another accountable to what is real, not searching for some magical cure or relief. To be religious is to acknowledge that our knowledge is limited, and so is our goodness. As people of faith, we can look with open, searching eyes at the problem of the global water supply and consider it our duty to do something about it with our very real human effort. Where the expediency of reason might tell us that there's no profit in providing for the poorest in the world, our hearts that have known suffering can say that there are measures greater than profit. Science alone will not always help us arrive at that fact. Our moral sensibility needs to be cultivated in community, and in community we gather to acknowledge that even when we come together, the best does not always happen. When we come together, we invoke something larger than the sum of these flawed parts that are ourselves. Many of us name that God, not in the sense of the magical creature who makes, does, sees, and controls all, but as the place where hope is possible with every bit of evidence to the contrary. The place where we meet the unanswered questions of human living and are stretched to the limits of both faith and reason is where we meet the sacred, whether we give it the name God or not. In our times of deep loneliness, we meet the mystery. In our times of greatest suffering, in our grasping for solid ground, we find that unseen and unknowable place. And we return with a deeper sense of who we are and who we want to become. We find deeper ways to live. When we practice that deeper living with one another, inviting ourselves into those places of suffering, getting to know them in each other, and helping each other to return with an appreciation of all that is, we shape a faith community. Here we find our salvation not in a promise from beyond us, in a literal tale of magical release, but acknowledge that we alone are not enough. In the midst of our understanding our limitations, we reach out for something unlimited. When we reach out of that place, we return with reverence. In these moments of pause and quiet on these snowy Sunday mornings, it's good to appreciate that religious community is one of the few places left in our culture where we can have interactions that last longer than it takes to put toppings on a slice of pizza. And we answer that question, are you a believer, with much more than a yes or a no. We answer with the experiences of our lives that have taught us something about how we ought to live, how and who we want to be, and what shape the world might take. In the words of Reinhold Niebuhr, nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. Therefore, we are saved by hope. Nothing true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we are saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we are saved by love. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as from our own. Therefore, we are saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness. As we turn the page to a new year, as we move in history toward a new chapter in the life of this community, we have the opportunity to offer these very human forms of salvation to one another. When we come together, we cultivate reverence for the ongoing miracle of our survival and carve a path for compassionate action that reflects the good we seek. We may have any number of names for it, but we must bring ourselves together to honor its movement in our lives so that we can take ourselves along gracefully. May we find the good, God or not, right here among us and out there far beyond us. So may we do. Amen. We enter into prayer by singing Find a Stillness, hymn number 352 in your gray hymnal.